You are Locked On Hawks Postcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta on the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome into the Locked On Hawks Postcast, your home for the best Atlanta Hawks talk. It's local insight. You can't get anywhere but here at Locked On. I'm your host, Tenitra Batiste. Alongside me is NBA and college basketball analyst DeShaun Tate. Today's episode is sponsored by GameTime. Download the GameTime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. And the Locked On Hawks Postcast is also part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So, unfortunately, it's another one of those days where we have to deliver the bad news. We're going to talk about that. And Trae may not be invited to San Fran, but a couple guys who play in the A word, we'll talk about that as well and download on it. But first, let's talk takes on how round 3 for the Hawks against the Cavs did not end well tonight, with the Hawks getting blown out. Cavaliers returning the favor for what the Hawks did in the first 2 games of this series this season with the 137-115 final. But despite the final score, DeShaun, you say 2 of the big 3 showed up tonight.
Yeah, what are we talking about here at this point now in terms of consecutive losses? Are we all the way up to number 7 at this point?
We are. Yep. Yeah, unlucky number 7.
Yeah, I know, right? I thought that was the lucky number. Now all
right.
of a sudden it's becoming the unlucky number. However that works. But no, 2 of the big 3 stepped up. Unless you've been living under a rock, you haven't been listening to our last few postcasts, shame on you, especially the last one where we really kind of talked about the things that they really need to improve on for this team, what's kind of been the Achilles heel or the things that have stuck out like a sore thumb a little bit, the elephants in the room, if you will, the free throw shooting, the turnovers, and the three-point shooting, the free throw shooting, and the turnovers, right?
Yes.
I'll start off with the good. It's good to see that at least taking a step in somewhat of the right direction. Only 11 turnovers on the night. And a lot of those, particularly in the first half or in the first quarter and, towards the back half of the second half. 0 turnovers in the second quarter I thought was good. But what we can't really allow and continue to allow is the 33% from 3. I want to give a little bit of grace on that sometimes, only because of the fact that in considering the roster and what the cards that they have to work with, or dealing the cards that that they have, they're forced to take 3-point shots if they want to be able to win some of these games, just because it's pretty much putting you in position where you're not exalting as much energy as trying to go for 2s and going to the paint and God forbid risking more injuries and energy. So they're forced to do that, but they're just not hitting those shots. And they're not just not hitting shots. Those aren't tough shots they're taking. Those are open shots. A lot of them, if you can remember to the last game, where DeAndre Hunter had a chance to either win or send in the overtime, whatever the case may have been, wide open from the top of the key, wasn't able to hit it. It ping pong balls over into the back of the backboard. So the other thing being a particular, department or category of which I don't think they did the worst job at. Definitely not a great job by any means. 74% from the free throw line. Again, free throw line, free space on the bingo card. There ain't many things in 2025 that you're going to be able to get for free, but that is one of them. 74% is not nearly as good of a job as they would need if they wanted to win this game. And those are the 2 things that kind of stuck out to me, and they couldn't afford that if they wanted to beat Cleveland for the 3rd time in only 3 meetings.
Yeah, and I hear what you're saying as far as the grace goes. I think in theory, it's a good thing to say, hey, we know that this Hawks team is still understaffed with no Bogdan Bogdanovic, where Garrison Matthews is not having a good day. You wonder where the 3-point shot is going to come from. And even to some degree, Jalen Johnson, outside of course, the Trae Young, and we'll talk about Jalen and the impact of not having him and what that'll be for the rest of the season. But ultimately, I can't give grace. And I can't give grace because I don't want anyone to think that this is okay. This is the NBA of 2025, where you are not going to get away with not getting a 3-point play. Reason I say it that way is because if your 3-point shot isn't hitting, you better get to the free throw line. And in the third quarter, I think it was, or second quarter, I think it was, they did a pretty decent job of getting to the free throw line, and a little bit in the third quarter. That's what kind of kept them in this game. But if you're not able to hit your threes, but the other teams are hitting their threes at a clip far better than you are, and the Hawks were fortunate tonight because that wasn't the case for the Cavs. What really got them was their field goal percentage that was at 58%. But ultimately, the average team is going to hit the three-pointer, and once they get that popping, it's on. So that's what are you going to do when that happens? Because that's where the league is leaning. So yeah, can't give grace. I'm sorry, because we only got one more week, and then you're out of grace. We'll talk about what that means a little bit later. Other piece is, I agree with you on the free throws. It's house money.
Yeah, it is.
I don't understand 74%. And at one point, I think the Cavaliers had 8 shots, right? Going to the free throw line 4 times. DeAndre Hunter went to the free throw line as many times as that entire team. Now, DeAndre Hunter did what he was supposed to do. He made his free throws tonight. But the challenge is this team cannot afford to be in a situation where they don't show up and show out in the fundamentals, because that is essentially what keeps them in the game. And how many times have we talked about it? 100 to 96. That free throw percentage was abysmal. 100 to 92. A few more free throws, and we could have been talking about a 2-game win streak heading into Cleveland versus a 6-game losing streak. Now 7 after Cleveland. So that's why I'm like, no, the margin of error has just gotten smaller and smaller for the Hawks, and they just can't afford not to go out there and play each and every person, play their A game every single night. Now, my take on this game was they got it down to 6, but the pesky third quarter wouldn't let them be great. And there were times, admittedly, during this season where we were excited because we said, hey, the Hawks are doing just what we want them to do. Quinn Snyder is making the adjustments, and the Hawks are playing accordingly, and they're coming out. And whether they took a lead into halftime or whether they had a deficit at the half, they came back on all cylinders, shooting. And when I say, firing, I should say, because they were shooting on both sides and defending, if you will. But then all of a sudden, we're starting to see that third quarter go back to those bad habits where the Hawks couldn't get a score. That's how you end up with 21 points. And yet the other team is scoring at almost double the clip when they end up with 39 in that quarter. So you saw the Hawks get ever so close, 6 points, within 6 points of the Cavs. And all of a sudden, I remember back-to-back threes, and it seemed like that was it. It seemed like the Cavaliers just went off and running. And again, if your baskets aren't falling, and the field goal percentage was decent, by the way, for the Hawks, it was 48%, but sometimes that's because you got to shoot the lights out later in the game. They've kind of taken their foot off the gas, or they have their second team in, whatever. But ultimately, it's the fact that when it mattered in that third quarter, when you were ever so close, the one thing that you needed to do when you got it down to 6 was get back on defense to make sure that you got to stop, which could have brought it down to 3 points or 4 points, get another stop. And we're talking about a tie game or you taking the lead on the road. Just didn't get there. We didn't get there.
Yeah. And it's unfortunate, Tenitra, because, I do really believe, I don't think this is a matter of guys not going out there playing. I mean, there has been some games where we talked about them looking like they're sleepwalking. This isn't one of those games.
No.
And I know that there are some instances, and I'm just being honest, where I'm looking at this and I'm like, this game probably could have been a lot more than I feel like it looked, right? It could have been worse to some degrees, right? But in that same breath, the injuries is not an excuse based on what they have going on. I mean, Cleveland had a couple injuries because they could afford to sustain rolling some guys out there based off the fact that some of their key contributors were hurt. But specifically, that's on the defensive side of the ball. That was Karis LeVert, who's at this point pretty much a veteran in this league, although he feels like he's always hurt all the time. And then Isaac Okoro, who was a lottery pick for them and probably the best defensive player that they have that can play in the forward, spot or on the guard spot to be able to guard the perimeter. So, they have their own issues in regards to that as well.
Sure.
But it was, they fought. Sometimes it was feeling like Zachary Reese-Shea was the only guy that looked like he wanted to play out there on the floor. I think at one point in time he was 7 for 7 going into the half. He had 20 points and hadn't missed a shot until 8 minutes in the third quarter. He also went on a run all by himself and scored 12 consecutive. But another thing that I think really hurt the Hawks was there was just too many stretches where they just couldn't get a shot to go their way at all. There was too many 7-0 runs, 8-0, 9-0 runs by Cleveland, things of that nature that kind of built up. That this was a game that, Atlanta could not afford to have they had to have minimal mistakes and errors that they could afford on their end. So, Cleveland took advantage like they were supposed to. I think they were still pretty hungry after knowing that they lost the only games that they had played against Atlanta, and they were able to get the all-star edge with a couple of their guys being selected too. So I think they just had everything going their way, and then it just worked out for them better in the end.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about Zach and the night that he had, but one is done. So what do the Hawks do with 1 week left to the trade deadline? We'll talk about it in the and one. This is a message from our sponsor, Intuit TurboTax. Taxes, waiting and wondering and worrying. That's what you do with taxes, right? If you are going to get any money back, if you owe, wondering and worrying. But taxes, well, it's matching with a TurboTax expert who can do your taxes as soon as 2 days, so that now taxes aren't such a kind of overcast cloud over your head, if you will, or an albatross around your neck. Now, an expert who gives your taxes their individual, undivided attention as they work on your return while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. That's what TurboTax does. An expert who'll find you every deduction possible and file every form, every investment, everything with 100% accuracy. Also, you can get the most money back guaranteed. No waiting, no wondering, no worries. Now, that is a good way to go into tax season. So get an expert now on TurboTax.com, only available with TurboTax Live full service, real-time updates only in iOS mobile app, and see guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. Well, DeShaun, we waited, we wondered why there was so much secrecy, why there was so much ambiguity about what was going on with Jalen Johnson. We've been kind of swinging around wondering for the last week what was going on. Well, the Hawks finally announced Wednesday that after he, of course, left that game a week ago against the Raptors, when he sustained that left shoulder dislocation, he was actually diagnosed with a torn labrum in that shoulder. So he's scheduled to undergo surgery next week, but of course that means he's done for the season. So when you first heard the news, I know you texted pretty much just the most cryptic text. And I couldn't even see the whole text. All I saw was Jalen. And I was like, oh, he's done. That was, before I was able to go and get the full read of what the Hawks sent out. But what was your first reaction when you got that news?
I was a little bit, I was slightly shocked, just a little bit. I mean, I did have a chance to go back and look at some replays of the shoulder, and by no means am I a doctor by any stretch of the imagination. But, it was a little bit shocking because I'm thinking based off the fact of how much left of the season that we still have for him to be able to, and there's, for all we know, still a chance to some degree with the way, doctors in medicine and healing and some of the best medical staff and whatever else, what have you, that there's a possibility of being able to get him back, fingers crossed. But I don't know. It's just, I just felt like initially, based on, it took me back to when I first saw the injury, and I'm like, definitely an injury. Ouch, that hurts. But it didn't give me a feeling of he would be out for the season. Yeah. And especially, like I said, because of the fact that it is so early, we are still every bit of at least a handful of games or slightly more away from the All-Star break. You get a little bit of All-Star break, and then obviously you come back and you still got a whole nother 41 games or whatever the number is to go. So again, it's definitely heartbreaking, of course, because you're already looking at, you know, the needs that you have, or the guys that you don't have specifically in the front court to be able to give you the offensive contribution. Like, can't even probably give you half of what Jaylen can give you. And some of them with a lot more experience than Jaylen has, and not nearly the pressure nor the responsibilities and duties that he has, all of these different things. So that's what really made me feel like this is not going into a good place. Plus, you factor in all the things that are just going on with this team from a roster standpoint. Guys are in and out of injuries. Guys aren't playing. Clint coming off the bench sometimes. Clint not playing sometimes. Clint in the starting lineup by default. Larry Nance with the hand, ... That was just my initial thought.
Yeah. And when I saw it, I think I was like you, a little bit shocked, because I'm thinking, okay, wow, we're putting him on the shelf 34 games left. But I do think that one of the keys to that is, you know how sometimes, and I can talk about that even now because I have a severe ankle and foot sprain. And just 5 days into that, I can feel it on my right foot, because I am putting a lot of pressure on that right foot and that right leg to compensate, which essentially is overcompensation. And I just kind of wonder, after that right shoulder was kind of bummed last season and then was a little tricky for him earlier this season, kept him out a couple games. Now, all of a sudden, the left shoulder is like, bam. And sometimes you just wonder, and I don't know whether the shoulder and the ankle foot issue are the same in how you overcompensate, but I do know typically when there's an injury, there's going to be some overcompensation. So my thought was, I wonder if, yes, of course, this is an injury to that left shoulder, but knowing that that right shoulder is not 100% either, the Hawks maybe decided, out of an abundance of caution, we'll just shelve him and shut him down for the season. But it definitely was shocking to me, because I guess I kept that optimism, that hope against hope, that maybe they would just say, okay, he's down 2 months, because that still means, hey, he can come back at the end of March and he can be with them for a playoff run, a postseason run. So yeah, I think I was just bummed. And you hate it because everywhere you see headlines, it was something we already knew. Breakout star Jalen Johnson. That was every headline. Breakout star, rising star Jalen Johnson. And so that's what I think we miss as well, because he was so infectious in what he was doing that I've called him 1B this entire season, 1A being Trae Young. I never called him 2, because I do think he was the 1B because of what he brought, the versatility in that front court. So that was a tough blow. But speaking of that, DeShaun, I mean, what's the biggest hit for you to this Hawks roster when you think about somebody like Jalen, who had some all-star buzz before he went down?
Yeah, I think that you said, what was the biggest hit?
For you, like when you look at his body of work, what's the biggest loss of that body of work to this Hawks roster as it's currently constructed?
In some ways, I think it's the fearless play. It's the confidence. I think. I don't think it's necessarily a statistic to necessarily point to, because I think that confidence that he comes to the game with. I think that you see that in his rebounding. You see that in his scoring. You see that in his ball handling, and sometimes he's pushing it up the floor all by himself, going coast to coast, and the defense is set and back and ready, and he's still finding a way to weave through them and finishing with a highlight dunk. So I think that there's multiple different things. I heard something on tonight where one of the color commentators mentioned something about, speaking with Trae Young or whatever, what have you, before the game, and kind of talked about Trae feeling like, he must be more aggressive now, not having Jalen Johnson out there on the floor with him, and how Jalen has been, secretly like one of those secondary offensive orchestrators, pushing it in transition and things like that. And that's always going to be one of those things that's going to be, kind of underrated, because we see the ball dominant player that Trae Young is. But if you watch enough of these games, then you will see, and this is how you can always kind of tell who's paying attention to games and who's not, of what Jalen Johnson is the way that he's grown and the way that he's shown other players. In some little ways, I think that in a very short window or span of time, that he's even helped a guy like a Zachary Reese-Shea with maybe some of his confidence.
I could say that.
We talk about Dyson Daniels leading by example in the defensive end. Some other guys sometimes just lead by examples in different ways. And I think that Jaylen Johnson is doing that. And sometimes it's just more so with his play. It's not necessarily about something that he's actually telling guys out there on the floor.
Oh, yeah, because he's still kind of that quiet assassin, if you will, except when he goes in with authority with one of those dunks. But he was a guy who just came out there, gave it his all every single game, and you couldn't help but kind of be excited about that. He was the one guy, because obviously Trae has gotten better on the defensive side of the ball, right? But if you break down Trae's game, it's still the game that it's always been, which is a great game, by the way. But with Jalen Johnson, I feel like if you dug into each aspect of his game, so on the offensive side of the ball, if you dug into him being like improving his ball handling skills, that's what I love about him. Every year, he's just stacked something on top of something else, right? And then he was starting to become that guy, because we've always talked about that leaky perimeter defense that the Hawks have. He's become that guy, or had become that guy, who was really helping them with some of that perimeter defense this season. And I felt like that was one of the reasons that the Hawks were a bit more competitive initially from deep. And I want to give him credit for improving his game from deep as well. But that said, I think that is going to put an immense amount of pressure on the Hawks organization and what they're going to do in just a week. Don't get me wrong. They've probably known this for a couple days, that Jalen was down, and I'm sure they'd already been ringing the phones, if you will, taking calls, if you will. But man, you want to talk about a dilemma now, because it's still, there's still no real backup for Trae Young. That's still a legit thing. You're still not quite sure what's going on at the 5, because Clint is, like you said, coming off the bench more often than not these days. But Onyeka is not quite, that true 5, if you will. So it's very, very interesting to see how this thing is going to play out. But what we all know is still a saga that's playing out is what's going on in San Fran. Some guys got the invitation tonight. Some guys did not. We'll talk about it in What's Next. This episode of our Locked On Hawks postcast is brought to you by GameTime. Attending NFL playoff games is an unforgettable experience that brings fans together. Now, I can remember the excitement and energy of a playoff game, albeit not as a fan, more so as a reporter, but it's still pretty exciting, and there are always great memories that come from that. So GameTime has a new feature called GameTime Picks that makes getting tickets for events even easier. It filters out all the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. GameTime Picks will help you find tickets, maybe last-minute tickets for the Super Bowl, possibly. Browsing through the deals was simple, and of course, you can find great value for all kinds of seats around a venue. And the Super Deal is especially impressive, offering the best value for the event. The app's features like seat views before you buy and all-in pricing with no surprise fees at checkout. And that makes the experience smooth and reliable. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with GameTime. Download the GameTime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Now, terms do apply, but again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download the GameTime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. So we got the word today, as we had talked about a couple days ago, all-star reserves were going to be announced. Eastern Conference reserves: Jaylen Brown, Pascal Siakam, Darius Garland, Evan Mobley, Cade Cunningham, Damian Lillard, and Tyler Hero. Well, social media was in an uproar, not just here in Atlanta, DeShaun, but really all across the country. A lot of people felt like, yet again, Trae Young was snubbed. So for you, 2 questions. Was he snubbed? And if he was, DeShaun, I just read that list of reserves to you. Whose place does he take?
Yeah, I definitely feel like there's a snub here. And I feel like this isn't the first time that we've said this. I got a feeling this probably isn't the second time that we've said this as well. No. Considering all of these things, first and foremost, I'm getting the feeling that this has very much to do with, the current trend and record that a lot of these guys have in this league.
Fair.
Seeing there's no way I think with what Cade Cunningham is doing, that I think that Cade Cunningham would probably or likely be on this list if we weren't having conversations about the Detroit Pistons looking like maybe coming from the graveyard and, maybe looking like the most improved team in the NBA or something like that. When you start talking about the Indiana Pacers, like some of these guys, I don't even feel like we're having realistic conversations about them being arguably the best player at their own positions, right? That's something that we can definitely say about Trae Young, that I think that he is in the same room or in that conversation where you can really have a real conversation about it. Pascal Siakam is not one of those guys. I don't really see all-star when I see Pascal Siakam. Darius Garland, I think, is a product of his team being the number one team. Not saying any of these guys are having a bad season, but I just think that it's very much reflecting on Trae with the type of season that he's having. I made a mention of it, quite a few times, of how go ahead and snub Trae again. He's just going to come out and be the same killer that he always appears to be when you find a way to leave him off of some of these lists. Is there a possibility, God forbid, injuries, whatever, what have you, that, there could be one of these guys that end up, because of I don't think we have an injury situation with any of these guys by any means, but and I feel like there was another guy. Oh, Tyler Hero having a good season.
Yeah.
Somebody's got to score the ball and do the things that Jimmy Butler used to do. I feel like that's more so why he's in that conversation right now. So, that's just kind of where I stand. I think that he could really be over any of those guys.
Yeah.
To be honest with you, Trae Young being the leader of assists in the NBA right now and having to deal with certain responsibilities and duties with the team that he's working with. Especially on the offensive end, I honestly don't really believe that that there's more than just one guy that Trae Young can be taking a spot over on this list.
Yeah, because I would agree with you. I think for me, the Tyler Hero one was probably the head scratcher of them all. And the Pascal Siakam one was probably right there with it as well. I just don't feel like I've seen anything out of those guys that tell me, hey, they deserve a spot on that team, except Trae. And I think too, it's interesting because last year, like you said, it was an injury that ultimately got him on the team. But every time he's gotten on that all-star team, he does something that's amazing. So whether it is the assists or whether he comes in the little 7 minutes that he gets and he scores like 10 points, there's always something exciting that he does when he makes that roster. So I'm not really sure what the deal is, other than, like you said, unfortunately for him, his team has taken a swoon, and maybe the voters feel like, or the coaches feel like, hey, regardless of what happens, other teams have players that go down to injury. You need to be able to put the team on your back and maybe have it. I don't know, but it's the most perplexing thing sometimes.
I have another elephant in the room question for you that I like to address. And I just want to get your personal opinion, because we're going to hear so much of this tonight and tomorrow. I'm sure you've heard it already. Let's just wake it up right here, right now. How much of this, what we're seeing, does Tenitra really believe has anything to do with whether it be coaches, whether it be players, whatever, what have you, just not liking Trae Young? Whether that's the person, whether that's the player, whether that's the villain label, whether that's everything that comes along with Trae Young. I'm sure this isn't the first time that you've heard any of this. Yeah. How much of this do you really believe has anything to do that he's consistently being snubbed from these all-star votes?
Oh yeah, it's that, because Isaiah Thomas talked about that. I think he'll be talking about it in maybe his upcoming book as well. Sometimes it's a little difficult to get away from your reputation. Now, granted, for Isaiah Thomas, it obviously worked to the tune of a couple of rings, right? But the one thing that still is a thorn in his side is not making that dream team, because the people on the dream team had the ability to keep off a guy that they didn't like because we know who was their boy.
Correct.
That said, I heard something today that made me chuckle about Jimmy Butler, and I'm going somewhere with this and then we'll wrap.
Okay.
The comment was, hey, will Jimmy Butler end up with the Suns? And the reality of it was the NBA analyst was talking about the fact that the NBA is just different because 2-3 weeks ago, the Miami Heat were demanding what you were going to give them. Like they want another star and they want picks on top of picks on top of picks. And the guy made a good point. By next week, Jimmy Butler's probably going to be in Phoenix.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the Heat were basically saying, you're not going to dictate where we send you, but he'll be in Phoenix and they won't get nearly what they thought they were going to get because the other piece is you don't want to not get anything for Jimmy Butler, which could happen as well. I say that to say this is the one league, and I'm not mad about this, by the way.
Okay.
This is the one league where the players really do run the show.
That's right.
So if the players are still feeling some type of way about Trae as the coach killer, or that dude was my guy and, Trae ran him out of town, or we heard that Trae didn't like this one or that one, or Trae's this and Trae's that. Sometimes your reputation actually precedes facts, and your reputation and the rumors become fact. So yeah, he may actually be a victim of that circumstance. And although we locally have seen the maturity, because like you said, we watch these games inside out every single night, every other night, everyone else is not watching that. So maybe they're not seeing the maturity, the growth, the evolution of Trae Young. And if you keep judging him, evaluating him like that human that you didn't really like before, you're probably going to seep into decision-making like this, if we're honest, because again, we all know this is that type of league that somebody will make a call, send a text, and things will not go so well. But things do go well for a couple of Skyhawks. Congrats to Daquan Plowden and Kevon Harris for being selected to the NBA G League Up Next game. That's a part of All-Star Weekend. Plowden, of course, had the game of his life against the Chicago Bulls as a two-way player for the Hawks a couple weeks ago. And I can tell you personally, Kevon Harris, night in, night out, puts those Skyhawks on his back, and that's why that team is winning at the clip that they are. Locked On Sports Atlanta is the #1 place to hang out after every game. Remember to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And for more on the Hawks, check out Locked On Hawks with our guy, Brad Rowland. We'll see you next time.